It's 2001, in a newly democratic Poland, 12 years after the fall of the USSR. A cyber activist collective, Cukt, the Central Bureau of Technical Culture, launches a civic electoral software, a program for cybernetic democracy that would transport politics into the realm of the virtual. The project includes a presidential candidate called Wiktoria Cukt, a female presenting avatar wearing an elegant hairstyle and a string of pearls. The opening of each of her headquarters was a mixed media rave, with images of Wiktoria projected onto the walls and her voice echoing through sparsely lit warehouses in Poland. What happened at the raves was filmed, digitized and circulated online, while at the same time the collective bought airtime on Polish TV and ran a multi-poster campaign in major Polish cities. Wiktoria was the best candidate for the information age because she was information, according to her makers. Programmed as a combination of her society's beliefs, she was a cybernetic phantom, an unedited summary of political desires and grievances. Anyone could submit any postulates they wished for her to represent through an online database. She intended to eliminate the need for human politicians and made plans for a universal basic income. This was 2001. Wiktoria also promised that she would install an internet connection in every household, turning Poland into Eastern European tiger of technology. That never happened. She fits the rhetoric of the early 2000s, when the idea of collective anonymity on the cyberspace was popular in the Western progressive imagination to which newly democratic Poland was eager to belong. She announced that her political program was a computer program, and the idea of digital direct democracy was very important and part of this westernized imagination emerging from the ruins of the USSR. For Wiktoria, politics meant the ability to control digital information. Unrestrained information can be lethal, she warned, or promised. For her makers, she was a simulacrum, but one that we can find in all of politics. Whomever we choose, they said, we will be choosing some form of Wiktoria Cukt. All of politics is a simulation, so we might as well take it to the logical conclusion. The birth of the internet was a volcanic time, brimming with possibility. Digging into the archive of early digital culture, we might uncover a pervasive sense of crisis and anxiety around new forms of political subjectivity. In 2002, so a year after Wiktoria Cukt, the Institute for New Culture Technologies in Austria, led by Konrad Becker, hosted a tactical workshop called Dark Markets, Infopolitics, Electronic Media and Democracy in Times of Crisis, with guiding questions like, has the internet still its digital potential to foster a network democracy from below, or can the internet be reclaimed as a digital commons? The conference marked a rapid decline of trust in the idea of global democracy after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The initial enthusiasm about globalization was quickly put to rest as the free market, guided by the EU, NATO, and IMF, was already turning into a disaster, they said, because of the rise of the European populist and culturalist right, global warming and the Kyoto Treaty drama, and the astonishing right from dot-com mania to plummeting stock markets worldwide. So the conference questioned whether anything like an electronic democracy could exist, but nevertheless, in a then popular spirit, advocated for the use of internet for social movements. While many watched with uneasiness the decentralization of markets, the idea of a decentralized, anarchic digital politics held sway in the early 2000s. Technological advancement modeled forms of political subjectivity that were considered progressive and productive because they were de-individualizing and dehumanizing. Throughout the 1990s, these non-hierarchical, ostensibly, spaces of the internet were praised for their ability to erase any physical manifestation of identity and central control, where under strings of digital avatars we would be able to escape the social repression that befalls us because our bodies appear to others in terms of ethnicity or sex in real life. Anonymity, mutability, and invisibility that online spaces afforded were the revolutionary horizon of feminist critiques at that time, where utopias could be constructed anew, and identity would no longer be defined by what we cannot control, the sex and racialized ideologies projected onto our bodies. As Donna Haraway noted, social subjects who are already used to thinking about their bodies as constructed, usually by others, and therefore available to reconstruction, would be most excited by the freedom from bodily determinism that the cyberspace promised. Of course, we cannot stress enough that this was before the dominant mode of using the internet became just the opposite. After the dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s, the American companies that run our internet decided to create revenue by selling our emotions, our behaviors, what is called behavioral data, to advertisers. This means that the internet is now built for the opposite. It rewards us for filling the cyberspace with photos of ourselves and extremely precise descriptions of who we are, what we believe, where we shop, and what we desire. Infused with this almost Protestant logic of defining being good with others seeing us as doing good, advertising and piety are merged into declarations of belonging to specific social groups and ever more specific advertising bubbles. In this convenient new business model of the internet, ethics and politics can only proceed from the personal, and therefore we constantly have to confirm who we are exactly. In this model of peer-to-peer surveillance, there is no space for identity ambiguity or the constant reconstruction of the self that early feminist critiques promised or championed. This is practically eliminated on business grounds, which are remarkably presented to us as ethical. To not declare yourself and identify yourself at every step is considered unethical because underneath it would be bad for the business of internet governance. It would literally collapse the internet governance model if we stopped personalizing the internet. But that is very difficult because, as Hong Kong artist Lam Hoi Sing says, we are all internet Americans. But back to the 90s, when this was not yet apparent and there were other ideas about what the cyberspace could be. Cyberfeminism, understood at this moment as an Anglophone voice in this discussion, appears at roughly the same time, 90s. It presents itself as a bodily understanding of the internet. In the 1990s, VNS Matrix in Australia proclaimed themselves as, I cite, the future cunt, the virus of the new world disorder, terminators of moral code, saboteurs of the big daddy mainframe. In these narratives, the threat of feminism arrives through touch, slime, blood, or other sensual matter invading abstract, immaterial technology. This type of cyberfeminism is impossible to separate from the cyberspace, a term that was born in American novels of cyberpunk by writers such as William Gibson or Pat Cunningham. In Burning Chrome, Gibson describes a disembodied territory that stored riches of data, the cyberspace, which could be accessed by catching a ride on a neural connection. American cyberpunk is an extension of the American Western, where the cyberspace is presented as this uncolonized dark land that needs to be mapped. The cyberfeminist idea at that time was that the female body itself was taken as such a dark land, against which the rational male mind defined itself because it was afraid of the dark materiality in which the feminine is regent. What would it mean in this context to treat Wiktoria Cukt as a cyberfeminist project following these rules? A virtual presidential candidate is a science-fictional proposition, as much as any female president in Poland is a science-fictional proposition. Both were so far from the truth of what was happening in politics that putting the two together only intensified the strangeness and the futurity. A female president, can you imagine? Women's technological, disembodied, virtual presence often corresponds to the absence of women in real public spaces. Helen Hester describes how the history of automation is tied to gendered work. Starting in the 1950s, machines were advertised as better than human at typically female secretarial jobs. During World War II, women's voices were used in airplane cockpits because women were not around in those spaces. Therefore, the sound of a female voice was more distinct and easier to hear for the male pilots. The proposition of a virtual female president was an exciting science fiction precisely because such a possibility in real life was unlikely and even actively eroded. Hester notes that work done by women is treated dismissively until the same work is done by a machine, at which moment it becomes the symbol of futurism and the human mastery of sophisticated tasks. So when our mom tells us to clean the room, we dismiss it, but when Alexa does it, we find it very impressive and futuristic. Women's presence is the cost of this futurist fantasy. But I want to go somewhere else as well. What if we leave for a moment the body or the avatar, the representation of women, and start our cyberfeminist exploration from some other place? In 2014, writes Chinese art historian Wang Xin, when the world was celebrating the internet's 25th birthday, the fact that the World Wide Web has never been worldwide was scarcely acknowledged or explored. Instead of rigorous specificity, however, the predominant reaction to this problem is too often, she writes, reduced to post-colonial thought and American racial dynamics, both widely mistaken as universal, as well as the obligation to translation, where the other has gained a voice, but only to continuously explain, qualify, and make sense of itself to the West. The post-Soviet could very well be such a self-orientalizing conceptual ornament, fetishized for its perceived otherness, and paraded as another foundation for cultural identity politics, nostalgic ethno-nationalism, or other paralyses of political imagination. But Wang Xin argues that this failure to understand any other internet but the Western is rooted in the illusion of instant access, which masks the real nature of the cyberspace, which she says is that time functions differently, radically so, across the web. Chinese language, she gives an example, shows a wide range of linguistic temporalities online, which means that the seemingly flat terrain of the internet is in fact a complex, uneven geography. I want to pay more attention to her argument about time. Unlike the body, time is not usually the main concept of feminist thought. Even though feminism is so intimately related to time, we either know feminism as a project of genealogy, looking at something that we think was repressed or neglected, or a futuristic utopia of a post-patriarchy. Artifacts from a less studied history of the internet, such as Wiktoria Cukt, are maybe decoys planted for politics that are yet to happen in a space that has already collapsed in history, the USSR. If feminism can be a question of time, it must also move beyond just genealogy, beyond uncovering what we think has been repressed or reclaiming what has been lost. As Diann Bauer of Laboria Cubonics told me, we need to think of communicating with the past not as simply a recovery, but as a micro-targeted engineering work to open up the future for us again, to think time otherwise. We could see artifacts like Wiktoria as wagers in the long game of history, to cite the xenofeminist manifesto by Bogna Konior, where xeno means alien. If we look at the xeno or the cyber in cyberfeminism or xenofeminism, through this tradition of focusing on the body and its representation, we remain within the well-known idea of feminism as an ethical and political program concerned with bodily autonomy for individuals and groups. But if we look at the alien or the cyber through the question of time, we are entering a different understanding of what feminism is. Here, and I will explain what I mean in a moment, feminism becomes a vessel that we only currently travel in, but one that is ultimately made obsolete. It is a raw material for inhuman operations of history. It challenges our idea of human agency, and it's more like game theory than ethics or politics. Within the second tradition of thinking about feminism as a question of time, in the 1990s, Sadie Plant explored the relationship between virtuality, femininity, and time through the question of simulation. For her, women and machines are related through their capacity for mimicry. She writes, "Women who know all about disguise, imitation, and artifice, they have been role-playing for millennia, always exhorted to act like a woman, to be ladylike, always to be like something, but never be anything in particular, least of all herself. There is as yet no such thing as being a real woman. Woman does not yet exist, except as how she appears on the screen." Throughout the history of Western thought, to be human meant to be a man. To be a woman was closer to animality, unreason, and deception. Women, not being fully human, could only earn the right to existence by performing themselves in rituals of femininity, by being an avatar. While a lot of feminist thought wants to repair this problem and make everyone see that women are not virtual, that women are human, for Plant, that women were perceived as objects or avatars was not entirely bad news. It created a bond between women and machines and made women into the vessels for the inhuman intelligence of cybernetic systems to come. Patriarchy uses women as its objects, avatars, symbols, its media, means of communication, reproduction, and exchange. But as the media multiply, women multiply. Plant argued that patriarchy unwittingly fell into the trap of these new technologies, and by making women objects, made women the future, because the future is defined by the artificial intelligence of objects. Women are a passage for machines, a tunnel opening up onto the future. The Turing test for machine intelligence indeed always was and still is, how well can a machine pretend to be a woman? In her platform statement, Wiktoria defines her politics as based in the aggregated output of humans and machines, and describes herself as the avatar of objectivity, professionalism, standardization, measurement, progress. In other words, she embodies every nightmare of post-1968 Western theory, which was basically against all that. Rather than embracing ideals prevailing on the other side of the Cold War, such as decentralization, horizontality, and locality, Wiktoria claimed that all social relations should be technical, economic, efficient, and massified. I could proclaim here, of course, that Wiktoria's makers couldn't help but project this patriarchal logic onto her, therefore somehow spoiling her feminist potential. And yet Sadie Plant would tell us that judgment is too quick. She would instruct us to remember that patriarchy cannot help but feminize itself through network technology. Following from that logic, Amy Ireland writes, "When artificial intelligence appears in culture coded as masculine, it is immediately grasped as a threat. To appear first as female is a far more cunning tactic. Woman, the inert tool of man, the intermediary, the mirror, the veil, or the screen, absolutely ubiquitous and totally invisible, just another passive component in the universal reproduction of the same. Man is vulnerable in a way that he cannot see, and since what he cannot see provides the conditions by which he sees himself, he has to lose himself in order to gain sight of the thing that threatens the self. Thus he is in a double bind. Either way, the thing he cannot see will destroy him. So both for Plant and Ireland, the spectacular, fetishized, objectified condition of women is not to be thought of. It's not to be protested. In the long run, it is precisely this ostensible safety and passivity of the woman object, the omnipresence of her virtual body produced in culture as an empty image, that allows for its mass replication. For Plant, cyberfeminism comes from the future, the present is only its retractive effect, and the multiplication of the seemingly passive woman image throughout history is basically the installation of spies for the progressive complexification of intelligence in the future. This is a long game that we are playing. From this standpoint, Wiktoria is a feminist case, and it doesn't matter what the intentions of her makers were. Perhaps the image of the woman is what will allow women to exit representation altogether, to exit the demands of the American internet with its constant drive for personalization and self-representation. Wiktoria might be a patriarchal fetish, buried somewhere in the archive of the web, an easy object of disdain. This image of a woman where there were no women marked the exclusion of female politicians from the politics in Poland, their missing bodies masked by the presence of Wiktoria's image. And yet, Wiktoria, the problematic cyber-feminist icon produced by this patriarchal logic, could be used as an intelligent distraction, a tool in what we could call, after Hito Steyerl, the politics of spam. For Steyerl, in today's image economy, we are represented to pieces. Instead of fighting for more authentic representations, we could use existing images as a form of camouflage. The digital is an encounter with femininity, not because it gives us representations that challenge gendered stereotypes, but on a more profound level, because it unites women and machines, digging holes under the well-trodden paths of men, opening up tunnels to somewhere else for all of us. Wiktoria Cukt and other fetishized feminoids captured in this net of female representations, trapped in a world without bodies, could be reinvented as a spam army, absolving us from our own participation in the spectacle. The avatars are multiplying, exaggerating themselves in their femininity, waiting for the right moment. These politics will happen somewhere else. So, Wiktoria was a Trojan horse. She was a virus that, if she was installed by popular vote, she aimed to expose the absurdity of popular votes and also the absurdity of human politics in the digital era. In this way, she is the horseman of the apocalypse that is always in the making. Following Plant and Ireland, women are commodities, black circuits for the negative operations of humanism. They are mediums, objects, fetishes, symbols of political fantasies. As avatars, women change hands. Women are vessels of operations without meaning, a pure form, a simulacrum. Women are cybernetic avatars, and all cybernetic avatars are women. Intelligence comes from the future as a thing, and it will live in things. This inhuman femininity is the repository that patriarchy created accidentally by excluding women from humanity. But what they started grows bigger than them. One of the reasons why I am interested in this type of thinking about feminism in relation to time is that it allows for the post-Soviet to have a dialogue with the Anglophone canon without falling into the trap described by Wang Xin, which is that the post-Soviet gains voice only to continually declare its own identity and represent itself to the West. The post-USSR is a stereotypical dark land in the Western academia, an institution that was created through the glorification of Western colonial exploits and maintains the spotlight by reversing this dynamic and making post-colonial thought the mainstream intellectual framework. But Poland falls on neither side of the West and the rest, or colonies and the colonizers divide. While there is a lot of studies that bridge the post-colonial and the post-Soviet, this might be simply because the only way for post-Soviet scholars to be heard is to make sense of themselves in a way that the West can understand, so through the colonial dynamic. But the post-Soviet reckons with the factual dissolution of a political and economic empire, while colonialism suffered less damage and is still experienced as the present rather than the post. The post-Soviet marks for us a loss of a utopia, the failure of socialism and communism that for so many in the West is seen as the future rather than the past. If identity happens in this ruined space, it is an identity in ruins. As Madina Tlostanova says, and I cite from her, the past 25 post-Soviet years have been marked by a strange reverse logic, a logic that falls outside the usual modern progressivism typical for the relations of the global North and South. We woke up one day to find ourselves in a new condition that was chosen for us by someone else. It was a condition of a dinosaur that somehow did not die in due time and had to languish in the backyards of history, which at that point indeed seemed to have reached its climax and come to a standstill in the eternal Western digital consumerist paradise. But this backyard of history, the fact that the post-USSR is stuck somewhere, pending in ruins, surrounded by the mute images of Wiktoria Cukt and other feminized spam, is maybe not so tragic for us. As Akbar Akbas writes in relation to the dissolution of national forms, I cite him, the wiping out of identity may not be an entirely negative thing, if it can be taken far enough. Not all identities are worth preserving. The future must not be another identity. It must learn how to survive a culture of disappearance by adopting strategies of disappearance. Artifacts like Wiktoria Cukt, reminding us of the Soviet tradition of automation and planned economy, of possible models of alternative governance, are planted there for us for a yet unforeseen reason, a politics yet to happen, a cyberfeminism coming from the future. Instead of emancipatory representation, here is the forever unfolding graveyard of patriarchal spam. From the position of the post-USSR, we see more clearly that our ideas of governance are limited by our experience of time. Western liberal democracy, which Poland did indeed get after the fall of the USSR, is a short-term structure of 4 or 8 years, and therefore it continually undoes what it achieves, and what it achieves is very limited. It keeps looping back into the past, and in European history, this model of democracy has often led us towards ethno-nationalism wrapped up in liberation rhetoric, or even straight-up fascism, which is what's happening now in Poland. The thing about post-Soviet cyber-feminist governance means that we cannot be scared to alienate ourselves from our experience of time and our current priorities, and learn to think about the long game of history and how inhuman technologies play this game with us, to learn to think beyond this loop that throws us back into the past. Thinking from the post-Soviet means not to further multiply perspectives from which we can challenge the universal. I see that again as not enough and something that belongs perhaps to the Western history of criticism. Instead, the post-Soviet lets us see through the long game of history, through an empire that has already fallen, that geohistorical positions are invalid in time. And perhaps it would benefit us to start seeing ourselves from the perspective of the technologies that survive us and survive those histories. If the current mode of cybernetic governance of the American internet is the imperative of constant self-representation, of constant revelation of our personal identity, Wiktoria Cukt can be an alternative for something else. Because she was not a representation of Polish identity, she was a mask that we could wear to escape from this idea of politics that is being reborn in post-Soviet spaces today. Thank you.